The gun was already pressed against Effie Keene's temple when Roscoe Thatcher walked through the saloon door. She had not screamed. That was the thing people would talk about afterward, in the way that small towns talk about the extraordinary things that happen to ordinary strangers who blow in on the wrong wind. She had not screamed, had not begged, had not done a single thing that the man holding the gun against her skull had expected her to do. She had simply looked across the smoky, lantern-lit room at the tall man in the doorway, a man she had known for exactly 11 days, and her eyes had said everything that her voice could not. Roscoe's hand moved to the Colt at his hip. He did not draw it, not yet. His eyes swept the room with the practiced calm of a man who had seen bad situations and worse ones, who knew that the difference between surviving and not surviving was rarely about how fast you moved. It was about how clearly you thought. "Harlan," Roscoe said. His voice was low and even, the voice of a man who had learned that rage was a luxury he could not afford. "You let her go right now, and I will let you walk out of Dusthellow alive." The man named Harlan Voss laughed, and it was the ugly, fractured laugh of someone who had convinced himself he had nothing left to lose. He was a big man, broad across the shoulders, with a jaw like a railroad tie and eyes that had gone flat and cold from years of making choices that no decent person would have made. He had come to Dusthellow with a secret that had followed Effie Keene across 3 territories, and he had found her here in this accidental place, in this life she had not planned. "You think I'm scared of you, Thatcher," Harlan said. The gun pressed harder, and Effie felt the cold metal in a place so close to thought, so close to everything she was, that she understood completely, and for the first time, what it meant to have something to lose. 11 days ago, she had boarded the wrong stagecoach. She had been standing in the red dust of the Tucson depot on a Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1878, her single travel trunk at her feet, and a ticket in her gloved hand that read Maricopa Wells. She had been tired, deeply and specifically tired in the way that a woman becomes tired when she has spent 6 months making a decision she does not entirely believe in. She was going to meet a man named Gerald Fitch, a cattle broker of moderate reputation and considerable correspondence, who had exchanged 14 letters with her through a matrimonial arrangement service out of Kansas City. Gerald Fitch had described himself as patient and God-fearing and steady, and Effie had thought that patient and steady sounded like something she could build a life on, even if it did not sound like anything that would ever make her heart move fast in her chest. She was 26 years old. She had a schoolteacher's certificate from the state of Missouri and a schoolteacher's salary that amounted to very little, and she had a mother back in St. Joseph who had taken to writing letters that always contained some variation of the phrase, "A woman of your years, Effie, cannot afford to be particular." She was not particularly particular, she had thought. She was just not yet willing to be desperate. But that Tuesday morning in Tucson, standing in the gritty September heat with her trunk and her ticket and her carefully constructed resignation, she had looked up from the paper and realized that the 2 stagecoaches at the depot were not clearly labeled, and the one on the left was already loading, and the driver was calling out that they were leaving, and she had made a decision in the space of 3 seconds that would change everything. She boarded the one on the left. The one on the left was not going to Maricopa Wells. The one on the left was going to a small and struggling town called Dusthellow, in the southern part of the Arizona Territory, a place that existed primarily because of a silver vein that had been discovered there in 1874 and was already showing signs of giving out. Effie did not discover her error until the coach had been rolling for 2 hours, and the driver, a leathery man named Crow who was not interested in conversation, had finally confirmed her destination when she asked. She had sat back against the cracked leather seat and looked out the window at the enormous, indifferent landscape, at the saguaros standing like sentinels against the burning blue sky, and she had thought about what to do. She had a small amount of money. She had the address of Gerald Fitch, who was expecting her on Thursday and who she had never met, and who she was not entirely certain she wanted to meet. She had, as her mother liked to point out, very few options. The stagecoach stopped in Dustalo in the late afternoon, when the light was doing something extraordinary to the desert, turning everything gold and amber, and the particular burnt orange that appears on the horizon just before the color drains entirely out of the world. Effie climbed down with her trunk and stood in the main street of Dustalo and looked around at what she had arrived in. It was a town that had seen better days and knew it. There was a general store with a porch that needed repairing, a livery stable, a small church that looked like it was held together partly by faith and partly by the determination of whoever had last repainted it, a saloon called the Copper Nail, a land office, and a scattering of other buildings that had the provisional, half-apologetic look of structures built by people who were not entirely sure they would be staying. There were people on the street, a few women in practical dresses, some men in dusty work clothes, a child chasing a dog between the hitching posts, and there was a man sitting on the top rail of the fence outside the livery stable, reading a book. This was the first thing about Roscoe Thatcher that struck her, before she knew his name, before she knew anything about him except the image itself. A man in a worn canvas shirt and dark trousers, with a hat pushed back on his head and a book open in his hands, sitting on a fence rail in the fading light of a desert afternoon, as though it was the most natural place in the world to read. He looked up when the stagecoach pulled away, and his eyes found her standing there with her trunk, and he did the thing that she would later think was entirely characteristic of him. He closed his book, climbed down from the fence, and walked over to ask if she needed help. "You look like someone who got where they were going and found out it wasn't where they meant to be," he said. He was not tall in an imposing way, but he was solid and unhurried, with dark eyes and a face that had spent a lot of time in the sun, not in a weathered and worn-out way, but in the way that certain faces are improved by exposure to the elements, the lines of it becoming more honest and more defined. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a year or two more, and there was something in the way he stood that suggested he had been tested and had not broken. "I boarded the wrong stagecoach," she said. It was the most honest summary she could offer. He looked at her for a moment. "That happens," he said. "Where were you going?" "Maricopa Wells." "Long way from here," he said. "Next coach through doesn't run until Thursday." Thursday was when Gerald Fitch was expecting her. Effie felt something loosen very slightly in her chest, something she had been holding tightly for months, some arrangement of obligation and resignation that had been disguised as a plan. "I see," she said. "There's a boarding house," the man said. "Mrs. Aldridge runs it. She's decent and fair, and her cooking won't kill you. I can carry your trunk if you'd like to get settled." "You don't have to do that," Effie said. "I'm aware," he said. "I'm Roscoe Thatcher. I run the land office at the end of the street. I know most of this town's business, because most of this town passes through that office at some point." "Effie Keene," she said, and held out her gloved hand, which he shook with a gravity that she thought was either very formal or very respectful, and which she later decided was both. He carried her trunk to Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house, which was a 2-story building with a garden out back that was losing the battle against the desert but had not entirely conceded. Mrs. Aldridge was a woman of about 60 with a sharp face and kind eyes, who took Effie's situation in at a glance and immediately began solving it. "2 nights, we'll call it 50 cents a night, meals included," she said. "And if you need to send a telegram, Roscoe can take you to the telegraph office in the morning." Roscoe left her there with a brief tip of his hat, and Effie stood in the small, clean room that Mrs. Aldridge showed her to, with its single window overlooking the backyard garden and the distant mountains going purple in the dusk, and she thought about the fact that she had not thought about Gerald Fitch in nearly an hour. She sent the telegram the next morning. She and Roscoe walked to the telegraph office together, and she composed a careful message to Gerald Fitch explaining that she had suffered a travel delay and would arrive on Saturday instead of Thursday. She did not say she had boarded the wrong coach. She said there had been a scheduling difficulty. This was not, she told herself, untrue. Roscoe waited while she composed and sent the telegram, leaning against the doorframe of the telegraph office with his arms folded and his hat pushed back in that way he had, watching the street outside with the particular attentiveness of a man who was responsible for the order of things. She learned more about him in pieces over those first 2 days, the way you learn a landscape by moving through it rather than looking at a picture of it. He had come to Tucson 4 years earlier from Texas, though he did not talk easily about what had brought him there or what he had left behind. He had a legal education, 2 years at a college in Austin that he had not finished for reasons he was oblique about, and he used it in the land office, and occasionally when disputes arose that required someone who could read a contract and explain it clearly. He was not the sheriff, but he was the kind of man that people brought their problems to, the kind of man who existed in every small community as a fixed point, a reference against which other things were measured. He was also, she noticed, alone in a way that was not loneliness exactly but something more considered than that, something that looked like a choice that had been made and then lived with for long enough that the edges had smoothed over. She should not have noticed these things. She was here for 2 days, and then she was going to Maricopa Wells to meet Gerald Fitch, who was patient and steady and who had written her 14 letters. She noticed them anyway. On the second afternoon, Roscoe asked her if she would like to see the town's one extraordinary feature, which was a spring-fed pool about a mile into the desert, surrounded by cottonwood trees that had somehow persisted in the landscape that should not have supported them. He said it was worth seeing if you had the time. She had the time. They rode out on 2 horses from the livery stable, and Effie, who had been riding since childhood in Missouri, felt the immediate and particular pleasure of being on horseback in good country, the saddle leather and the smell of the horse, and the enormous sky pressing down on the desert in that late afternoon way. The pool was exactly as he had described it, a small miracle of water in the dry country, the cottonwoods casting dappled shade over the surface and the rocks around it worn smooth by water and weather. They sat on the rocks and said very little for a while, and the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that happens between people who are not afraid of each other. "What are you going to Maricopa Wells for?" he asked eventually. She had been expecting the question and had been deciding, somewhere in the back of her mind, how honestly to answer it. "To meet a man I've been corresponding with," she said, "a matrimonial arrangement." He looked at her with no particular expression. "Do you want to?" he asked. It was a direct question, the kind that only certain people are willing to ask because it opens the door to an honest answer that might be inconvenient. "I think I made a sensible decision," she said carefully. "That's not the same thing," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." They rode back to Tucson in the cooling evening, and neither of them said anything more about Gerald Fitch. But something had shifted in the way that things shift when honesty enters a conversation, like a window being opened in a room that has been closed too long. She had told herself she was going to Maricopa Wells on Saturday. She had told Gerald Fitch she was coming on Saturday. And then Friday happened. Friday began with a disturbance at the Copper Nail Saloon, which Roscoe went to deal with before 8 in the morning, because there were men in Tucson who started early and a few of them were not careful about the distinction between a dispute and a fight. Effie watched from the street as Roscoe talked 2 men down from what looked like it wanted very much to become violence, his voice carrying the quality of absolute certainty, the kind of tone that makes people believe that the alternative he's proposing is in their best interest, even when they are too angry to see it clearly. The town watched too, in the way small towns watch things that they are used to watching and still find interesting. And in the watching, Effie heard pieces of what people said about Roscoe Thatcher, the way you hear a biography assembled from fragments. "He was in some trouble down in Texas," said a woman named Pearl Hennessy, who ran the dress shop and who was inclined to talk. "Never did get the whole story, But he came here and he's been good for this town, I'll say that." "What kind of trouble?" Effie asked, because she was a woman who asked direct questions when they mattered. Pearl made a gesture that was non-committal. Something about a woman and a man who was not good to her. Roscoe was involved somehow. The way I heard it, he did the right thing and paid a price for it. Effie sat with this information the way you sit with something that adds to what you already sense about a person, that fills in the outline with color and texture. That afternoon, she was in the general store when the man named Harlan Voss arrived in Dusthellow. She did not know his name yet. She did not know that he was the reason she should have been more careful, should have covered her tracks better between St. Joseph and Tucson. She had thought she was safe because she had been careful, because she had not told anyone where exactly she was going, because she had arranged the matrimonial correspondence through a third party. She had thought she was beyond the reach of the thing she had run from. Harlan Voss was the brother of a man named Curtis Voss, who had been Effie's employer in St. Joseph for 2 years, and who had made her life into something she could not continue to live. Curtis Voss was a man who believed that his money entitled him to things that other people's dignity should have protected them from, and who had made it clear in ways that were both overt and insidious that Effie working in his household was a leverage he intended to use. She had left St. Joseph without notice, quietly and quickly, taking nothing that was not hers, and leaving a letter that said only that she was going, and that no one should try to find her. Curtis Voss, apparently, had not respected this request. Harlan Voss came into the general store while Effie was buying a small tin of peppermints, because she had always believed that peppermints were a thing worth having in uncertain times, and he walked in and saw her, and the expression on his face was the flat, satisfied expression of a man who has been looking for something and has found it. "Miss Keene," he said. She felt ice move through her. She looked at him and understood immediately what his presence here meant, what it had cost to track her, what it said about the intentions of the man who had sent him. And she thought, very clearly in that first cold second, "This is a trap, and I have been in it for longer than I knew." She said nothing. She put the tin of peppermints down on the counter and walked toward the door with the measured pace of a woman who is not going to run because running confirms that there is something to run from. He caught her arm in the doorway. "Curtis wants to speak with you," he said. "You left without finishing your obligations." "I had no obligations," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it. "I had an employment contract which I fulfilled and I left. That is legal and I owe your brother nothing." "He sees it different," Harlan said. "That is his right," she said. "Let go of my arm." He did not let go. And that was when Roscoe came around the corner of the street and stopped, taking in the scene at the door of the general store with the precise and efficient assessment of someone trained by experience to read a situation in the space between one heartbeat and the next. "Problem," he said. He was not aggressive. He was simply present, and present in a way that had weight to it. Harlan Voss looked at him. "Private matter," he said. "Lady looks like she disagrees," Roscoe said. "And she's standing in my town's general store doorway, which makes it my business by extension." The hold on her arm released, slowly and with the particular reluctance of a man who is calculating rather than retreating. Harlan Voss was not stupid. He had come into an unfamiliar place and encountered an unfamiliar obstacle, and he was recalibrating. "I'll be in town tonight," he said to Effie. His eyes carried the message clearly. "This is not finished." Roscoe stood beside her as Harlan Voss walked away down the street toward the Copper Nail. He did not ask her what had just happened. He waited. "I need to explain something," Effie said. "You don't owe me an explanation," Roscoe said. "But if you want to give one, I'll listen." They walked to the land office, and she sat in the chair across from his desk and told him the truth. All of it. She told him about Curtis Voss and the 2 years of employment that had become something ugly and threatening, about the way power operates in an enclosed space, about leaving and about the matrimonial correspondence, and about the plan to get far enough away that she could not be followed. She told him about the 14 letters from Gerald Fitch and what they represented, which was a calculated distance from a situation she did not know how to escape any other way. Roscoe listened. His face did not move through judgment or shock or any of the expressions that people sometimes arrange when they are hearing something difficult, some expression that is more about their own discomfort than about the person speaking. He just listened, and when she was done, the silence lasted a few seconds, and then he said, "He has no legal claim on you." "I know that," she said. "But knowing that and being safe are not the same thing," he said. "I know that too," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the desk in front of him. "Harlan Voss has a history in 3 territories," he said. "I've seen his name on some paperwork that came through this office. He's not a man who stops when he's supposed to." "No," she agreed, "he isn't." "You should stay tonight," Roscoe said, "and tomorrow don't get on the coach to Maricopa Wells." She looked at him. The afternoon light came through the land office window at a low angle and lay across the floor in long, bright stripes. "That's a significant thing to ask," she said. "I know it is," he said. And then, because he was Roscoe Thatcher, and he did not take cover behind indirect language when direct language was available, "It's not only about Voss." The silence that followed was one of those silences that changes the air in a room, that makes everything that came before it feel like a prelude. Effie looked at him, and he looked at her, and she thought about 14 letters from a man she had never met, and a plan she had made in a state of careful desperation, and a pool of spring water surrounded by cottonwood trees in the desert. "I'll stay," she said. She sent a second telegram to Gerald Fitch that evening. It was more honestly composed than the first. It said that there had been a complication of a personal nature, that she was unable to continue to Maricopa Wells at this time, and that she was releasing him from any understanding between them, and hoped he would find what he was looking for. She felt, sending it, the particular and surprising lightness of a door being closed that had been open too long and letting in a draft. That night, Harlan Voss broke into Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house. He came in through the ground floor window in the dead of the night hours, when the town was quiet, and the desert was doing its nighttime thing, cooling rapidly and filling with the sounds of insects and the occasional distant call of something wild. Mrs. Aldridge's dog heard him first, and the dog's barking woke the house, and by the time Effie was at her door she could hear Harlan Voss moving in the hallway below. She did not freeze. She had spent 2 years in a situation that required her to make rapid assessments and rapid decisions, and she had developed the skill of moving her mind quickly through possibilities and landing on the one that made sense. She went out the back window of her room and across the garden and down the alley beside the boarding house, barefoot and in her nightgown, moving as quietly as the night would allow. She went to the land office. It was locked, but she remembered that Roscoe had shown her that the side window had a latch that didn't properly catch. She got it open and climbed in and found the lamp on the desk by feel and lit it. And then she found the dark blanket that was folded over the chair back and wrapped it around herself and sat down on the floor against the wall and did something she had not done in a very long time. She shook. Not from cold. The desert night was cold, but not terribly so, but from the accumulated weight of everything she had been carrying, the 2 years of endurance and the plan and the wrong stagecoach and the 14 letters and the moment in the general store doorway, and the sending of the telegram, and now this man in the night who had come across 3 territories to drag her back to a place that had no hold on her except the hold that fear allows. The door opened. She had not even heard footsteps. Roscoe came in with a rifle in one hand and stopped when he saw her on the floor in the lamplight. The rifle lowered immediately. He crossed the room in 4 steps, came down to one knee in front of her, and put his hand on her arm with a gentleness that was, she thought, the most careful thing anyone had ever done in her presence. "Aldridge sent her boy for me," he said quietly. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said. "I went out the window." "Smart," he said. And then, because he saw what was happening with her, the shaking and the overwhelm of it, He sat down on the floor beside her and stayed there, close enough that his shoulder was warm against hers, and he did not say anything. He just stayed. She stopped shaking after a while. The lamp made the office small and warm. Outside somewhere she could hear Dusthelow's night constable making his rounds. "He's going to keep coming," she said eventually. "Not if we make it clear what happens when he does," Roscoe said. "What does happen when he does?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "He gets to face the full weight of the law," he said. "Which, given that he broke into a home tonight, gives us considerable options. And he gets to face me personally, which is a separate matter." There was something in the way he said that, not aggressive, not theatrical, just factual, that made her believe it completely. She looked at his profile in the lamplight and thought about what Pearl Hennessy had said about Texas and a woman and a man who was not good to her. "What happened in Texas?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My sister. She married a man who was not what he claimed to be. When I understood what was happening, I tried to intervene." He paused. "It went badly for a while. She's safe now. Remarried, lives in New Mexico. But there was a period of time where I was not on the right side of certain people's opinions." "You paid a price for doing the right thing," she said. "Some prices are worth paying," he said. She understood then, fully and completely, what kind of man he was. Not a man without darkness in his past, not a man without complicated history, but a man who had walked into hard situations because they needed walking into, and who had not flinched from the cost of it. She thought about the man who had listened to her story that afternoon without rearranging his face into judgment, and who had asked her to stay in this small, failing town in the desert, and who had sat down on the floor beside her at midnight because she was shaking. She reached out and took his hand where it rested on his knee, and he did not move for a second, and then he turned his hand over so that his fingers closed around hers, and they sat like that in the light of the single lamp until the desert began to turn pale with the first suggestion of morning. Harlan Voss had not been caught that night. The constable had found signs of the entry at the boarding house, but Harlan Voss himself had disappeared back into the dark, the way men like him did when the immediate opportunity failed, retreating to plan the next approach. Roscoe was at the land office before sunrise, writing a legal complaint. Effie helped him with it, sitting across the desk with paper and a pen, because she had the schoolteacher's gift of precise language, and she knew exactly what had happened and how to describe it in a way that left no room for equivocation. The complaint named Harlan Voss by name and detailed the entry, and described the history that had preceded it, and Roscoe dispatched it with the morning rider to the territorial marshal's office in Tucson. The waiting that followed was the hardest kind, the waiting in which you know that something is coming but not when or in what form. Dusthellow went about its business in the days after, the way small towns go about their business when there is trouble in the air, with a slightly heightened attention, a collective awareness that something was unresolved. Effie helped Mrs. Aldridge with the boarding house and spent evenings in the land office talking with Roscoe, long conversations that ranged across everything and nothing, that had the quality of conversations between people who are discovering that they want to know everything about each other. She told him about Missouri and her parents and the schoolroom and the books she loved, and the things that had made her want more than what her life had offered before. He told her about Texas and the law courses and a father who had died when he was 19 and a mother who had gone back east to her family, and a sense of drifting that had eventually brought him to the Arizona territory and stopped him in Dusthellow because there was a need here and he had decided to meet it. "Do you like it here?" she asked one evening. They were on the front step of the land office, the night air cooling around them, the stars doing what desert stars do, which is to be entirely overwhelming in their abundance and brightness. "I've made peace with it," he said. Then more slowly, as though working out something he had not quite articulated before, "I thought I was going to be something different when I was younger, a lawyer in a city, something large, but there's something about a small place that needs you. It's not glamorous, but it's real. I trained to be a teacher," she said, "and I liked it. the actual teaching part. Children learning things the moment when something clicks. But the life around it, the smallness of what it allowed, a woman on her own with a teacher's wage, that was harder. "Did you want something large too?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "I wanted something real," she said. "I think that's what I was trying to get to. I kept making sensible decisions that led me further away from it, and the matrimonial arrangement was the most sensible and furthest away of all." He was quiet. Then he said, "I'm glad you got on the wrong coach." She looked at him, and he was looking at her, and the dark between them was warm and close, and she thought about saying something careful and redirecting, the thing she might have done 6 months ago, the thing the version of herself who made only sensible decisions would have done. Instead, she said, "So am I." The next day, Harlan Voss came back. He came into the Copper Nail Saloon in the late afternoon, when it was beginning to fill up with the men who came in after the day's work was done, and he had a drink at the bar and made conversation with the barkeeper in the way of a man who is establishing himself in a space. Several people who knew the situation were watching him. Word moved in Dusthellow the way word moves in all small towns, which is faster than the people involved would prefer. Roscoe was in the saloon within 10 minutes of Harlan's arrival. Effie was with him because they had been coming from the general store when the word reached them, and she was not willing to be left somewhere separate and unaware of what was happening. She was the one Harlan looked at first. "Miss Keene," he said. His voice was almost pleasant, the way threats can be pleasant when they have been dressed up to look like conversation. "My brother wants to speak with you. In person. He's made arrangements to travel out here, which is a significant inconvenience to him." "Your brother has no right to speak with me," she said. "I left his employment legally and I owe him nothing." "He sees it as more complicated than that," Harlan said. "He sees is not relevant to the law," Roscoe said. He was standing close to Effie, not protectively in a way that undermined her, but present in a way that added weight to the situation. "Miss Keene has filed a legal complaint regarding your entry into Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house. I'd advise you to spend your remaining time in Dusthellow being very careful." "Is that a threat, Thatcher?" Harlan said. His voice had dropped. "It's legal information," Roscoe said, "which is my area of expertise." Something moved behind Harlan Voss's eyes, some calculation being made, some decision reaching a final point. Effie saw it before it happened, because she had learned in 2 years of proximity to men like this to read the moment when consideration ended and action began. Harlan's hand moved to the gun at his hip. Several things happened in rapid succession. The saloon went very still. Roscoe's hand moved to his Colt, and Harlan changed his mind about the draw, recalculated, and grabbed Effie instead, pulling her against him and pressing the gun he had drawn to her temple in one fast motion. This was the moment from which everything had started. The room held its breath. Roscoe stood in the doorway because he had stepped back when Harlan grabbed her, putting space between himself and the gun, which was tactically correct, and which cost him something she could see in his face, a precise and controlled something that she understood was a kind of fury that was being held at an enormous internal pressure. "Harlan," Roscoe said, "you let her go right now, and I will let you walk out of Dusthellow alive." "You think I am scared of you, Thatcher," Harlan said. The room was absolutely still. A lamp swung slightly in the draft from the door. Effie could feel the cold metal at her temple and the iron grip of Harlan's arm across her chest, and she thought, with a clarity that she found almost strange, about the fact that she had not come here by accident. Whatever the route had been, whatever the wrong coach and the 2 days and the wrong telegram and the decision to stay, she had arrived somewhere that was correct in a way she had never felt about any decision she had made in the preceding 10 years. She thought about Roscoe's hand over hers on the floor of the land office. She went very still. "Harlan," she said quietly, addressing him directly for the first time, "put the gun down." He laughed, that ugly fractured laugh. "You don't give the orders here." "I know," she said. "I'm not giving an order. I'm telling you what is going to happen, because in this room there are at least 6 men who are deciding right now whether you live through this afternoon, And every second you hold this gun, you are making their decision easier. She felt him shift, a slight uncertainty in the grip. Your brother sent you here, she said, because he wanted to use you the same way he always uses people. He put you in an impossible position. You tracked me across 3 territories for a man who sees you as a tool. You know that. You've always known that. The grip loosened by a fraction. She felt it. Put it down, she said. This is the last moment where walking away is still possible. There was a silence that lasted approximately 5 seconds and felt like 5 years. Then Harlan Voss lowered the gun. Roscoe crossed the room in 2 strides and had the gun out of his hand, and Harlan Voss facing the wall with his hands behind him, in the time it took the rest of the saloon to exhale. The constable came through the door 40 seconds later, having been summoned by a boy who had been watching from the street. Effie stood in the middle of the Copper Nail saloon and looked at her own hands, which were shaking again, and then looked up at Roscoe, who was looking back at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. It was unguarded in a way that his face rarely was, all the careful control of it briefly set aside, and what was underneath was something that she thought was going to take a long time to understand fully, and that she was deeply, entirely certain she wanted to take the time to understand. He walked to her and stood close, and she had the sense of all the space in the room collapsing down to the few inches between them. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "And then I talked him down." "You did," he said. "I didn't know I could do that," she said. "I did," he said. Harlan Voss was held in the constable's custody while a wire was sent to Tucson. The territorial marshal's office responded within 2 days, and a deputy arrived to take Harlan back to Tucson, where the breaking and entering charge and the assault with a firearm charge were sufficient to ensure that he would be occupied with legal proceedings for a considerable time. Roscoe's carefully worded legal complaint had done its work precisely as intended. A second wire, one that Roscoe sent on Effie's behalf to the authorities in St. Joseph, addressed the matter of Curtis Voss directly. The specifics of what Curtis Voss had done in his own household, documented in Effie's account and supplemented by the evidence that Harlan Voss's pursuit of her provided, were sufficient to draw serious official attention. Curtis Voss was a man of money but not of sufficient influence to completely suppress an official inquiry, and the knowledge that he was being looked at seriously would, Roscoe said, be enough to ensure that he never sent anyone after Effie again. "Is it over?" Effie asked, when the deputy from Tucson had ridden out of Dusthellow with Harlan Voss in tow. "The immediate threat is over," Roscoe said. "The legal matter in St. Joseph will take time, but you're safe here." She noticed that he had said here specifically, not in general, not anywhere, here. "Is that an invitation?" she asked. He looked at her with that careful steadiness that she had come to understand was not the absence of emotion but the management of it, a man who felt things deeply and had learned to be deliberate about how he let them appear. "It could be," he said. She stayed. She had always, she realized, been going to stay. In the weeks that followed, Dusthellow became a place she knew in her own right, not as a stop on a journey to somewhere else, not as a temporary shelter from a threat, but as a place where she was present and known and beginning to be at home. She made arrangements with Mrs. Aldridge for a longer stay, a proper rental of the upstairs room, and she began to establish herself in the small dailiness of the town. The school situation presented itself almost immediately. Dusthellow had a schoolroom, a one-room building near the church, but no teacher. The previous teacher, a young man from back east, had lasted 8 months before the isolation, and the distance from everything familiar had driven him back to Ohio. The parents of Dusthelow's 30-odd school-age children had been making do with intermittent teaching arrangements for nearly a year. Effie went to the town's council meeting, which happened on the first Tuesday of October, and presented herself and her credentials and asked to be considered for the teaching position. The council, which consisted of 5 men and operated with the slightly bewildered informality of volunteer governance in a small western town, looked at her Missouri teaching certificate and her steady and direct manner of speaking and agreed on the spot. She was in the schoolroom the following Monday morning with 31 children of various ages and levels of preparation, and she felt, standing at the front of that room with the chalk in her hand and the desert light coming through the windows, something settle into place inside her that she recognized as purpose. Roscoe came to see her after her first day. He had brought coffee in a small tin pot from the Copper Nail because the land office had no proper kitchen, and this was what he did when he had occasion to bring something: coffee from the Copper Nail wrapped in a cloth to keep it from burning his hand. "How was it?" he asked. "It was everything," she said. She was still at the desk at the front of the room, grading the simple reading exercise she had given the older children. "There's a girl named Clara Banks who is 9 years old and reads at a level that is remarkable for her age and has not been given anything demanding enough to hold her interest. And there's a boy named Tommy Rigsby who is 11 and has been told he cannot learn, and who most assuredly can if someone pays him proper attention." Roscoe sat in one of the student chairs, which was slightly too small for him, and which he occupied with the good-natured dignity of a man who understands that size is not the primary measure of things. He drank his coffee and listened to her talk about Clara Banks and Tommy Rigsby, and the primer book she needed, and the lesson plan she was constructing, and his face was open and warm in a way that she had begun to think of as his private face, the one that appeared when they were alone together and the managed exterior softened. They fell into a pattern. She walked past the land office every morning and every evening, and most days one of them stopped to speak with the other. On Sundays they walked to the spring pool together. It had become their walk, belonging to the two of them in the unspoken way that places belong to the people who return to them. They ate Sunday supper at Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house together, which Mrs. Aldridge arranged without commentary but with evident satisfaction. October became November. The desert cooled from its summer extremity into something that was almost gentle, the air sharp and clean in the mornings, the afternoon still warm and golden. The cottonwoods at the spring pool turned a color that she had not expected, a vivid, luminous yellow that stood against the blue sky and the red rock like something from a painting. One Sunday in November, they were sitting by the spring pool in the late afternoon when Roscoe said, carefully, and with the deliberateness that characterized the things he said that mattered most, "I want to tell you what happened in Texas more completely." She waited. He told her about his sister Ida, who had married a rancher named Caldwell when she was 19, and who had learned by degrees what Caldwell was, a man whose charm was a careful surface over something controlled and cold. He told her about going to Ida's aid and the confrontation with Caldwell that had followed, about the legal trouble that had arisen when Caldwell, who had money and connections, had turned the incident into a criminal matter against Roscoe. He told her about 18 months of legal proceeding that had eventually cleared him but had consumed his resources and his reputation in Austin, and about the decision to move west and begin again somewhere the name Roscoe Thatcher was not attached to anything complicated. "Ida is safe," he said. "I said that before and it's true. She left Caldwell during the proceedings, which gave her grounds for divorce that the court recognized. She remarried 2 years ago. A man named Peterson who runs a dry goods store in Santa Fe. I visited them in the spring. She is happy in a way she was not before." "And you?" Effie said. He was looking at the pool, at the yellow-leafed cottonwoods reflecting in the still water. "I've been working towards something I couldn't quite name," he said. "Dusthellow gave me purpose and structure, but it has been missing something. I think I knew it was missing, but I had concluded, more or less, that I was simply the kind of person who was going to remain alone. And now," she said. He turned to look at her, and his dark eyes were entirely direct in the way they were when he had decided to say the thing he was thinking. "Now I'm sitting beside someone who came here on the wrong coach," he said, "and who talked a man with a gun pointed at her into putting it down, and who is teaching 31 children in a room where the windows need replacing and doing it magnificently. And I think that I was wrong about being the kind of person who was going to remain alone. She felt something move through her, a warmth that began in her chest and extended outward. "You are not a man who speaks without thinking," she said. "No," he agreed. "So that means something," she said. "It means everything," he said. "If you are willing." She looked at him across the small distance between them, this deliberate and honest man who had sat on the floor beside her at midnight and had spent 4 years in a small failing town because it needed him, and had listened to her story without judgment, and had sent legal complaints in careful language to protect her, and had come to her classroom with coffee in a tin pot to hear about Clara Banks and Tommy Rigsby. "I am willing," she said. He reached across and took her hand, the same gesture he had made on the floor of the land office, but this time in full daylight, by the clear water under the yellow trees, with the desert spread out around them in its enormous quiet, and everything was different and everything was exactly right. The courtship, formal in the way of 1878 and the small town West, was conducted with a seriousness that suited them both. Roscoe called on her at Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house on 3 evenings a week, and on Sunday afternoons. They talked with the depth and range that characterized everything between them, about law and education and politics, and the territorial question of whether Arizona would eventually become a state, about books, about the fundamental questions of how a person should live. He gave her a copy of George Eliot's Middlemarch, which she had not read, with a note inside the front cover that said only, "For Effie, who understands what it means to want a real life." She read it in 2 weeks and brought it back to him with pages folded at the passages that had moved her, and they spent an entire Sunday discussing it. She gave him back the conversations he had needed without knowing he had needed them, the ongoing and earnest examination of things that mattered, conducted between equals who respected each other's minds as much as anything else. She thought sometimes about the 14 letters from Gerald Fitch, those careful and adequate letters, and felt the distance between what those letters had represented and what she had found here, and it was not cruelty toward Gerald Fitch to acknowledge that there was no comparison. In December, 3 things happened that marked the turning point of everything. The first was a letter from St. Joseph that arrived for Effie through the marshal's office in Tucson, informing her that Curtis Voss had been formally charged under Missouri law with offenses related to his conduct in his household, and that the case was being prosecuted with the expectation of a successful outcome. The official nature of the proceedings meant that any further harassment on his part would constitute additional criminal liability. The letter was dry and official, and it was also, Effie thought, the sound of a door closing on something that had been open and drafty for 2 years. She read it in the land office, which had become a place she came to as naturally as anywhere in Dusthellow, and when she had finished reading it, she set it down on the desk and looked at Roscoe and said, "It's over." He looked at her face and read what was in it accurately, the relief and the release of something that had been carried for a long time. He came around the desk and without any ceremony at all took her face in his hands and kissed her, for the first time, with the same deliberate and entire quality that he brought to everything he did, as though he had thought about it carefully and having decided, committed fully. She kissed him back with everything she had. The second thing that happened in December was that the silver vein, which had been giving out, was struck again in a new location, 3 miles from the original mine. A survey crew had been poking around the hills south of Dusthellow, and they had found, buried in a seam of quartz, evidence of a second deposit that the geological indications suggested was significantly larger than the first. This news arrived in town on a Thursday, and by Friday the land office had more business than it had seen in 2 years, because when silver is found, the paperwork follows immediately. Roscoe worked until midnight for a week, processing claims and verifying surveys, and drafting the legal language that accompanied each transaction, and Effie brought him meals from Mrs. Aldridge's kitchen and sat at the secondary desk in the office and helped him organize the documentation. They worked side by side in the lamplight, efficiently and in a comfortable silence broken by occasional consultation, and she thought that this was also a kind of intimacy, the sharing of productive work, the alignment of capability. "Dusthellow is not failing anymore," she said one night, sorting claim documents into the wooden file boxes that lined the office wall. "No," he agreed from the desk where he was writing. "It appears not." "Does that change things for you?" she asked. She meant, does the reason you came and the reason you stayed still apply if the town grows and changes? He looked up from the writing. "What changes things for me," he said, "has nothing to do with the silver." She smiled at the document she was holding. The third thing that happened in December was that Roscoe Thatcher asked Effie Keene to marry him. He did it on a Sunday afternoon by the spring pool, which was their place, in a way that was absolutely characteristic of him. Directly, seriously, and with complete honesty about what he was asking and what it meant. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not because it's sensible, not because it's practical, not because it's the obvious next step in a courtship that has proceeded according to convention. Because you are the person I want to face every morning and every difficulty with. And because the version of my life that contains you is so much more fully real than the one before you arrived that I can no longer remember what I was waiting for." She was looking at him, at the afternoon light on his face and the clear water behind him and the desert stretching out in every direction. And she thought about a woman standing in a depot in Tucson with a ticket to Maricopa Wells in her hand and the particular exhaustion of making sensible decisions. And she thought about the moment of boarding the wrong coach and how a mistake can be the truest thing a person ever does. "Yes," she said. "With everything I am, yes." They were married in January of 1879 in Dusthelow's small church, on a clear winter day when the air was cold and brilliant, and the mountains to the north had a light dusting of snow on their highest peaks. Mrs. Aldridge was there, and Pearl Hennessy from the dress shop, and the constable, and the barkeeper from the Copper Nail, and the families of the children Effie taught, who filled the small building to overflowing. Clara Banks was there, serious and bright-eyed, and Tommy Rigsby, who had been learning to read with the focused intensity of someone making up for lost time. Roscoe wore a dark suit that fit him well and looked at Effie when she came through the church door with the expression of a man who is looking at the specific and irreplaceable thing he has been missing without being able to name it. And she wore a dress that Pearl Hennessy had made from the bolt of deep blue wool that had come in on the last supply wagon, because she had never wanted white for this, and the blue suited both the day and the truth of who she was. They said their vows to each other with the clear voices of people who mean what they are saying completely, and have thought about it carefully, and are not afraid. The minister, a gentle man named Reverend Boone, who had been in Dusthellow for 6 of its 8 years, and who had watched it fail and was now watching it survive, said afterward that it was the most concentrated wedding ceremony he had ever performed, meaning by this that it was brief in its formal components but enormously dense in its actual content, the two people at the center of it manifestly very present and very genuine. After, there was a gathering at Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house, where the long table in the dining room was covered with food that the town's women had collectively produced, roast beef and potato dishes and pies of several kinds and fresh bread. And the evening went long with talking and music from a fiddle that one of the miners played with considerable skill. At some point in the evening, Effie found herself standing with Mrs. Aldridge in the kitchen, where they had gone to replenish the pie, and Mrs. Aldridge said, "I knew that first evening when he carried your trunk here. I could see it in the way he looked at you. He didn't know yet, but it was already there." "I think I knew too," Effie said. "On some level I couldn't name yet." "That's how it works," Mrs. Aldridge said, with the authority of a woman who had loved and lost and lived long enough to know what love looks like from the outside when it is the real kind. It's already there before you understand what you're seeing. Roscoe came to find her, as he always came to find her when she had been absent from a room for long enough. He put his hand at the small of her back in that way he had, a light and certain touch, and she leaned into it, and Mrs. Aldridge smiled at her pie and said nothing. They moved into a house in January, one that Roscoe had arranged the purchase of through the land office, a two-story building on the east edge of town that had been built during the optimistic early silver years and was solid and well constructed, with a good front porch and a south-facing garden plot, and rooms that they filled gradually with the accumulation of their shared life. Roscoe's books, which turned out to number several hundred, occupied most of one wall of the front room in the shelves he built across 3 weekends in February. She brought her own books, and her teaching materials, and the small personal things she had carried from Missouri, and she arranged them in the house with the deep and particular pleasure of a woman who is putting things in a place where they will stay. The spring came early that year, or what passed for spring in southern Arizona, which was more of a warming and a flowering and a greening of things that had been gray, and Effie's south-facing garden plot proved to have good soil that had been lying fallow. She planted beans and squash and a kitchen herb patch, and in the evenings she and Roscoe sat on the front porch in the cooling air and watched the town they were both, in their different ways, responsible for. Dusthellow was growing. The second silver vein had attracted people, new families, new businesses, a second saloon that was slightly less rough than the first, a doctor who had come down from Tucson and decided to stay. The school had expanded to the point where Effie was petitioning the town council for a second room and a part-time assistant teacher. Clara Banks, who was now 10, had started helping the younger students with their reading in a way that made Effie think she was watching a teacher form in real time. In the summer of 1879, Effie told Roscoe she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen of their house on a Monday evening when he came in from the land office, and she watched his face move through surprise and then a kind of wonder that was entirely different from his usual deliberateness, something unguarded and bright that she had never seen on his face before. He sat down heavily in the kitchen chair, which was not a dramatic or graceful response but was entirely genuine, and then he looked up at her and said, "Effie." "I know," she said. She was smiling. He got up and crossed the kitchen and held her with a care and a fierceness combined that she thought was exactly right for what the moment was, and she rested her face against the warmth of his neck and felt the enormity of it, the life they were making in this accidental, correct place. The pregnancy went well through the summer and into the fall. She taught through September and into October, and the children of Dusthellow, who had grown deeply attached to their teacher, became extremely solicitous, bringing her water and arranging her chair, and treating the entire situation with the seriousness of small people who understand that something important is happening. Roscoe was attentive in the way he was attentive to everything that mattered to him, which was to say consistently and practically, and without making her feel managed. He took on the heavier domestic tasks without discussion, and walked with her every evening and read to her from his books when her eyes tired. And she thought sometimes that the version of herself who had composed careful letters to Gerald Fitch would not recognize the life she was living or the ease of it. The baby came in November of 1879, in the house on the east side of town, attended by the doctor from Tucson who had settled in Dusthellow and by Mrs. Aldridge, who had experience in these matters and who was present as a friend. It was a boy, a fact that Roscoe discovered when the doctor placed the infant in his arms, and his face did something that Effie, watching from the bed, thought was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. A man who had been alone for a long time and who had arrived at something he had not allowed himself to want. They named him Samuel, after Roscoe's father. Samuel Thatcher grew into his first year in the house on the east side of Dusthellow with the particular confidence of a child who is entirely loved and entirely secure. He was a solid, bright child who observed everything around him with enormous dark eyes that were his father's exactly, and who developed opinions about things at a rate that suggested he had gotten his mother's direct mind as well. The letter from Ida arrived in the spring of 1880. Ida Peterson, Roscoe's sister, wrote to say that she had heard he was married and that she and her husband Joseph were hoping to visit during the summer, if the journey was manageable. She said she had heard good things about Tucson and that she wanted to meet the woman who had made her brother smile in the one photograph he had sent, a photograph taken outside the church on their wedding day. They came in July, Ida and Joseph Peterson, traveling down from Santa Fe by stage, and Ida was a small dark-haired woman with her brother's steady eyes and a warmth that was entirely her own, who walked into the house on the east side of Tucson and took Effie's hands and said, "You are exactly who I hoped you would be." They stayed for 2 weeks. Roscoe and his sister walked the town together and talked in the low voices of siblings who have been through a complicated history and arrived somewhere good, and Effie watched them from the front porch sometimes, the two of them moving through the afternoon, and felt the rightness of it, the healing of something that had been broken. Ida held Samuel and said he was magnificently serious for a baby, which was accurate, and Joseph helped Roscoe repair the back fence of the house, which had been needing attention, and the four of them ate dinner together every evening on the front porch in the summer dark, talking about everything. On the last evening, Ida said to Effie privately, "He wrote to me after you arrived, after the second day. He didn't say much, but what he said was that there was a woman in Tucson who had come on the wrong stage and who talked with the precision of someone who had thought seriously about things. That was all he said, but I could hear something in the way he wrote it." "What could you hear?" Effie asked. "That he was awake again," Ida said. "That something had started. He went quiet like that in Austin before things went wrong, but this was different. This was the kind of quiet that comes before something good." Effie looked out at the desert, at the evening sky doing its performance of colors, and thought about a depot in Tucson and a wrong coach and the particular shape that a life can take when you stop insisting on the planned route. "I am glad the stage was on the left," she said. Ida laughed, a genuine, delighted laugh. "So am I," she said. The years that followed were full in the way that good lives are full, not without difficulty, not without the ordinary hardships and losses that are part of any life honestly lived, but full of the real things, work and purpose and love, and the accumulated dailiness of a life shared between two people who continue to choose each other. Tucson became a proper town. By 1882, it had a population of nearly 400, a newspaper, a proper school building with 2 rooms and a second teacher who had come down from Phoenix, a hotel, a bank, and all the infrastructure of a place that has committed to existing. The silver held, better than anyone had expected, and the people who had stayed through the thin years were now prospering in the generous ones. Roscoe's land office expanded into a proper legal practice. He took on a clerk, a young man named Dale Archer who had legal training and who Roscoe mentored with the same steady deliberateness he brought to everything. He became a person of consequence in the territorial legal community, not in the grand way he had once imagined from Austin, but in the way that matters more, the way of someone who is exactly where they are needed and doing the work with full commitment. Effie's school grew with the town. She was offered the position of head of the school's Board of Education in 1881, and she took it with the practical energy of a woman who knows exactly what she wants to do and does not waste time being modest about her capability. She fought for better books and better building, and for the inclusion of children who were sometimes excluded from educational opportunity. And she won most of the fights in the methodical and articulate way of someone who has prepared her case fully before making it. Clara Banks, who was now 13, was so clearly a future teacher that Effie had already written a letter of recommendation for her eventual application to the Territorial Normal School, to be held until it was needed. Tommy Rigsby had become a confident reader and had discovered, somewhere in his 11th year, that he had a gift for mathematics that exceeded anything Effie could teach him. She had found him a correspondence course through the Territorial Education Office and was already writing letters on his behalf to people who might be able to help him go further. She taught the children of Dusthellow with the same full attention she had brought to Samuel's first year, with the conviction that each child had something specific and important to offer, and that the teacher's job was to find it and make space for it. The school became a point of pride for the town, which was very much a thing she had made happen. In the autumn of 1882, their second child was born. A daughter this time, a red-faced and opinionated daughter who arrived in October in the middle of a desert rainstorm, which was unusual enough to be commented on, and who made her opinions about the world known from the first hour in a voice that could not be ignored. They named her Ruth, after Effie's grandmother, and she was everything her older brother was not in temperament, while sharing his eyes and his mother's directness. Samuel, who was nearly 3, regarded his sister with the cautious assessment of a small person encountering something complicated, and then decided within about 2 weeks that she was acceptable. He was observed by Effie sitting beside her cradle one afternoon, talking to her in a low and patient voice about what a rabbit was, which he had recently learned from a picture book, and she thought that Roscoe's steadiness had already moved into the next generation. Roscoe held Ruth the way he had held Samuel, with the competence of a man who has learned to do something and does it fully, and with a tenderness that was entirely his own. "Two," he said, one evening when both children were asleep and the house was quiet and they were sitting on the front porch in the October air. "Two," she agreed. "I was going to be alone," he said. That was what I had concluded. It was a wrong conclusion, she said. He looked at her sideways in that way he had. "The luckiest wrong conclusion I ever made," he said. "I was going to marry Gerald Fitch," she said. That was what I had concluded. "Wrong coach," he said. "Wrong coach," she agreed. "Right place." The front porch of the house on the east side of Dusthellow looked out over the street, and beyond it to the desert, which stretched away in the evening light with the enormous, indifferent beauty that had struck her the first time she had seen it, and that had never stopped striking her. The mountains in the distance were going purple, and the sky above them was the deep, transparent blue that only appears in the west, in high, dry air. And somewhere down the street, a lamp had been lit in a window, and the warm square of it was visible against the darkening. "Roscoe," she said. He said. He was relaxed in the way he was rarely relaxed, settled in his chair with his long legs extended and his face quiet. "I am going to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I boarded that coach on purpose," she said. "Not consciously. I don't mean I knew what I was doing. But some part of me, some part that was tired of sensible decisions and planned routes and doing what was practical, that part chose the wrong coach on purpose. And I think that is the most honest thing I have ever done." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think you might be right. I think I was always going to end up somewhere like here," she said, "somewhere real. I just needed to stop following the plan long enough to find it." He reached over in the dark and took her hand, the same gesture, always the same gesture, the deliberate and complete closing of his hand around hers that said everything he meant without requiring more words than were necessary. They sat on the front porch of their house in the growing dark. In the town they had both helped to build from different directions, with their children asleep inside, and the desert doing its vast, quiet work around them. And Effie Keene Thatcher thought about all the wrong choices that had turned out to be exactly right, and felt the completeness of a life that had arrived at its true location. The years continued to be generous. Samuel started school in the fall of 1884, arriving at his mother's schoolroom as a student for the first time, which created a situation that both of them navigated with great seriousness and some private amusement. He was a diligent student and a fair one, who did not trade on the family connection, and who Effie treated with the same even hand she gave every child, which she thought was both the right thing and a source of considerable character building for him. Ruth, at 2, was already the most opinionated person in the household, which was a significant achievement given that the household contained Effie, and she had her father utterly managed in the way that certain daughters manage certain fathers, not through manipulation, but through the specific and precise deployment of directness that Roscoe found he was completely unprepared to resist. He had been resisted by armed men without visible difficulty. He had never managed to say no to Ruth when she looked at him with those clear dark eyes and stated her position with complete logical support. Effie found this endlessly amusing. Roscoe was aware that he was being laughed at and accepted it as a fair price. In 1884, Roscoe was invited to serve on a territorial legal commission that was examining land rights questions in preparation for Arizona's eventual statehood, which was still years away, but was beginning to feel like something that would happen. He served on the commission for 2 years, traveling to Tucson 4 times a year for meetings, and the work he did there on the clarification of mining rights and homestead law was significant enough to be noted in the territorial record. He came home from each trip with the specific and complete reorientation of a man who is always glad to leave important things and return to the important thing, and the house on the east side of Dustalo was always the right place to come back to. Effie, in 1885, published a small monograph through the Territorial Education Office on the teaching of reading to children who had been previously assessed as unable to learn, drawing on her years of experience with children like Tommy Rigsby. The monograph was adopted by 3 territorial schools as a reference document. She received a letter about it from the Superintendent of Territorial Education, a formal letter of commendation that she put in the drawer of her desk at school and did not mention at home until Roscoe found it there accidentally. "You didn't tell me," he said, holding the letter. "It's a letter," she said. "From the territorial superintendent," he said. "He's a very nice man," she said. Roscoe looked at her with the fond exasperation of a man who is entirely in love with someone who refuses to make a sufficiently large deal of their own accomplishments. "Effie," he said. "I know," she said, smiling. "It was a good monograph." "It is an excellent monograph," he said. "And you are an extraordinary person." "That is your opinion," she said. "It is a correct opinion," he said. He put the letter down and pulled her toward him and kissed her in the middle of the school office with the complete absence of self-consciousness of a man who knows exactly what he has and does not forget to be grateful for it. The town of Dustalo incorporated formally as a municipality in 1886, and Roscoe Thatcher was elected the first mayor of the town that had been failing when he arrived and was now, by any reasonable measure, thriving. He accepted the position with the quiet seriousness with which he accepted most things, and served with the same even-handed attention to the actual people of the place that had always characterized his work there. Effie was in the audience at the incorporation ceremony, with Samuel at her side and Ruth in her arms, and she watched her husband take the oath of office in the clear morning air of a November day, in the town they had both arrived at by different routes, and she thought about the word home and everything it contained. It was not the life she had planned. None of it was the life she had planned. Not the wrong coach or the desert town or the man reading a book on a fence rail or the school or the silver or the small miracles of 2 sleeping children and a house on the east side of a street in a place she had never meant to go to. None of it was the plan. All of it was real. In the spring of 1887, when Samuel was 7 and Ruth was 4 and Dustalo had finished building its first proper brick building, which was the new school, Effie found out there was a 3rd baby coming. She told Roscoe on a Sunday afternoon by the spring pool, their pool, where the cottonwoods had grown taller over the years and the water was still clear and cold, and the rocks were still worn smooth by water and time. He looked at her, and the expression that moved across his face was one she recognized now, one she had cataloged over the 8 years of knowing him, the one that meant he was feeling something enormous and managing it with only partial success. His eyes were bright. "Again," he said. "Again," she confirmed. "Are you well?" he asked, because that was always what he asked first before any other question. "I'm very well," she said. "I feel completely well." He put his arm around her, and she leaned against his shoulder, and they sat by the spring pool in the afternoon of the desert spring, with the cottonwoods going green above them and the water clear below them, and the town they had built together going about its life a mile away. "I came here on the wrong coach," she said. She said it the way you say a thing that has become a story you both know and love, the way certain sentences become part of the foundation of a shared life. "You came here on exactly the right coach," he said. He pressed his lips to her hair. "The same thing," she said. "The same thing," he agreed. The third child, another boy, was born in October of 1887, a round and vigorous child whom they named Thomas, after no one in particular except that Roscoe had always liked the name, and Effie had agreed it suited what she could already see of him. Something solid and good-natured and built for endurance. Samuel regarded his new brother with the proprietary interest of an older child who has been through this before and knows what it means. And Ruth, at 4, immediately determined that the baby was hers specifically, and began directing the household's attention to his needs with a managerial thoroughness that Roscoe said was entirely her mother. "I am not like that," Effie said. Everyone in the house disagreed. The house on the east side of Dusthellow expanded in 1888, a third bedroom added onto the back for the growing necessity of the space, and Roscoe built it himself on the weekends with the help of his clerk Dale Archer and the constable and 2 of the miners who had become friends over the years. The children helped in the way children help with construction, which is to say they were energetically present and occasionally useful and always interested, and the house grew around them all. Mrs. Aldridge died in the spring of 1889 at the age of 71, peacefully in her own home, which she had lived in for 22 years. The whole of Dusthellow came to her funeral, because she had been the kind of person who had offered a room and a fair price to travelers who had lost their way, and the town knew what that meant for its own story. Effie wept and held Roscoe's hand throughout the service and thought about that first evening, the small room with the window overlooking the garden, the woman with the sharp face and the kind eyes who had taken her situation in at a glance and immediately begun solving it. She put flowers on the grave from the garden at the boarding house, which a niece of Mrs. Aldridge's was now running, and said a private thank you to the woman who had taken her in on the night she arrived, confused and alone, on the wrong stage, in exactly the right place. In the summer of 1889, Clara Banks left Dusthellow for the Territorial Normal School in Tempe, with Effie's letter of recommendation and a school board scholarship that Effie had spent 2 years arranging. She came to say goodbye to Effie in the schoolroom, and they held each other in the middle of the room where Clara had first shown who she was at 9 years old, and Effie said, "You are going to be the best teacher they have ever produced. And when you come back, and I hope very much that you come back, I will make sure there is a classroom waiting." Clara came back, 3 years later, as a fully certified teacher, and took the second classroom in the new school building with the authority and capability of someone who had been building toward it for her whole life. Tommy Rigsby, by that time, was at a mathematics program in San Francisco, the letters of recommendation that Effie had been writing for years having eventually found the right door. He wrote to her from California, "Mrs. Thatcher, I was 11 years old and someone told me I would never learn. I'm sorry to report that this has proven incorrect." She read the letter at breakfast and laughed until there were tears on her face, and Roscoe looked at her over his coffee with a warmth that had not diminished in 11 years of mornings. The children grew. Samuel at 12 was his father's son in most ways that mattered, steady and thoughtful and good with words, and he had already announced his intention to study law, which Roscoe received with the appropriate modesty, and then privately, with a pride that Effie thought was the most endearing thing she had ever witnessed. Ruth at 9 was her own thing entirely, which was exactly right. She had her mother's mind and her father's steadiness, and some additional quantity of fire that seemed to be exclusively her own. And she was already the person in her class that the other children came to when something needed organizing, or when a problem needed arguing through. Thomas at 5 was amiable and solid and deeply happy, a child who liked animals and the outdoors and the physical world in all its forms, who spent his afternoons following his father around the property asking questions about how things worked and why. Roscoe answered every question with full seriousness, which Effie thought was the thing she had fallen in love with first, before she knew she was falling, the man who treated questions as deserving of real answers. By 1890, Dusthellow was a real town in all the senses that mattered, incorporated and functional and full of people who had chosen it, or been led to it by the particular combination of intention and accident that brings people to the places where they are meant to be. The silver still ran, deeper now but still giving. The school had 3 classrooms. The church had been properly rebuilt in stone. There was a reading library, established by Effie in 1886, that occupied 2 rooms of the old land office, because Roscoe had moved the legal practice to a proper building on the main street. The library contained, among its several hundred volumes, a worn copy of Middlemarch with pages folded at the passages that moved a woman on a November Sunday 11 years earlier, and a note inside the front cover in Roscoe's hand that said, "For Effie, who understands what it means to want a real life." She had donated it to the library herself, and she had written a small card to go with it that said only, "From Effie and Roscoe Thatcher. This book matters." On a Sunday morning in the autumn of 1890, Effie and Roscoe walked to the spring pool. The cottonwoods were at the peak of their fall color, the same luminous yellow that had struck her 11 years before, the same specific beauty that had not diminished by repetition but had deepened by it, the way beautiful things become more beautiful when you have shared them enough times that they are part of the texture of a life. They sat on the smooth rocks as they always had. The pool was clear and cold. The mountains were doing their purple thing on the horizon. "What are you thinking?" he asked. He always asked this after a comfortable silence because he was still and always curious about what was happening in her mind. "I was thinking about the depot in Tucson," she said, "in 1878, standing there with my trunk and my ticket and my resignation." "What about it?" he said. "I was thinking that if I had turned right instead of left," she said, "I would be somewhere else entirely, and I would not know what I was missing. I would have a life that made sense on paper, and I would not know this one was possible." He was quiet for a moment. "Do you think about it often?" he asked. Not jealously, not anxiously, just directly. "Sometimes," she said, "not with regret, with gratitude. For the accident of it." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they looked at the water and the yellow leaves and the enormous sky. "You knew," she said, "when I told you about Maricopa Wells. You asked me if I wanted to go, and I said I had made a sensible decision. You said that wasn't the same thing." "I remember," he said. "You were right," she said. "I usually am," he said. She felt the smile in it. She laughed and pressed closer to him, and he held her there, in their place, in the desert that had always been large enough to contain everything that needed containing, and the cottonwood leaves came down around them one at a time in the still air, each one its own small completed thing falling to the right place. Effie Keene Thatcher, née Keene, had boarded the wrong stagecoach in Tucson in September of 1878. She had arrived in a small, failing town in the Arizona Territory and met a man reading a book on a fence rail in the afternoon light. She had talked a man with a gun at her temple into putting it down. She had found her purpose in a one-room schoolroom with children who needed exactly what she had to give. She had married Roscoe Thatcher on a cold January day in a church that was held together partly by faith. She had raised 3 children in a house on the east side of a street, in a place she had never planned to go. She had lived a life that was real, deeply and completely real, in all the ways that the word means anything. The wrong coach had known something she did not. It had taken her exactly where she had always, underneath the plans and the sensible decisions and the resigned arrangements, been trying to go. She had boarded the wrong stage. She had ended up exactly where she was always meant to be. The cottonwood leaves came down in the still air of the desert autumn, and the spring pool was clear, and the mountains were blue-purple in the distance, and Roscoe Thatcher held his wife in the quiet of their place, and neither of them needed to say anything more. Everything that needed saying had already been said, in the 11 years of mornings and evenings, and Sunday walks and lamplight and children's laughter and serious conversations, and the deliberate, entire, ongoing choice of each other. It had been said every time he handed her coffee from the copper nail, and every time she told him about Clara Banks, and every time he turned his hand over to close his fingers around hers, and every time she leaned into the warmth of his shoulder in the desert night. It had been said on the floor of the land office at midnight, and at the spring pool in November, and in the church on a cold January morning, and on the front porch in 1,000 evenings of ordinary, extraordinary life. It was the truest thing either of them had ever said, and they had been saying it every day for 11 years, and they would say it every day for all the days that remained to them in this accidental and correct place in this real and chosen life. The wrong stage, the right place, the only place, always.